your eyes, take you wonder my wonder, over sideways and under on a map.
You know this voice, even if you've never heard his name. It's in Beauty and the Beast. It's in A Whole New World. It soundtracked your childhood. On June 2nd, 2026, at exactly 5 p.m., that voice went quiet for the last time. And what his family said afterward changes how this story should be told. Before we get into it, if this kind of story moves you, take a second to subscribe to the Untold story and hit the bell. We cover the real stories behind famous lives, the ones that go deeper than any headline ever will. Now let's get into it. He was born Robert Peabo Bryson on April 13, 1951, in Greenville, South Carolina. The name Peabo came from his family's French West Indian roots, and it would later become Peabo for a reason that sounds almost too simple to be true. The leader of his first band couldn't pronounce it correctly, so it shifted slightly into something easier to say. And that's the name the world would come to know. Much of his childhood was spent on his grandfather's farm in Mauldin, South Carolina, a small town just outside Greenville. He was raised primarily by two women, his mother Marie and his grandmother. In his own words, decades later, he described what that meant to him directly. I think the sensitivity in my songs stems from my early childhood. I was raised by women, my grandmother until she died, and my mother. My grandmother was a woman who lived and loved with incredible passion. That sentence is worth sitting with for a moment, because it's not the kind of thing artists usually say about where their sound comes from. Most performers point to influences, other singers, other records, other stages. Peabo Bryson pointed to two women on a farm in South Carolina who loved with their whole bodies, and said that's where the songs came from. School was a different story entirely. He described it, in his own words, as horrible. Not because of the curriculum or the teachers in the way people usually mean it, but because of what he called a strange kind of prejudice. Black students, he said, were sometimes resentful of other black students who showed ambition. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the polished biographies, but it tells you something important. Even within his own community, as a kid, wanting more than what was expected of you could make you a target. Music became the place where none of that mattered. His mother took the family to concerts featuring some of the best-known black performers of the era, and something in young Peabo locked on to that experience and never let go. Not as a hobby, as a direction. At 14 years old, he made his professional debut, singing backup vocals for a local Greenville group called Al Freeman and the Upsetters. A boy who didn't fully fit anywhere, not always at school, not always at home, had found the one place where he did. And 2 years later, at 16, he would leave home for good, heading down a road that doesn't exist in the music industry anymore. For a reason. At 16, Bryson left Greenville to tour with a band called Moses Dillard and the Textown Display. The circuit they traveled was known, at the time, as the Chitlin Circuit, a network of venues across the segregated South where black performers could reliably find work, find audiences, and find each other during an era when most of the country's stages were closed to them. It was not glamorous, it was survival, and it was apprenticeship. And for a 16-year-old kid from South Carolina, it was an education that no school could have given him. By the time he was 16, he was already working as a lyricist, arranger, and producer for Bang Records. A job description that most adults in the music industry don't reach until much later in their careers, if ever. His first real break came during a recording session at Atlanta's Bang Records studios. The band he was touring with didn't quite land with the label, but Bryson, the backup singer, the teenager, caught the ear of the label's general manager, a man named Eddie Bisco. Bisco signed him not as a performer first, but as a writer, producer, and arranger, and then encouraged him to start performing his own material. In 1976, he released his debut album, simply titled Peabo, on Bullet Records. He wrote nearly every song on it himself, some with the legendary songwriter Tom Bell, and the background vocals featured a then-unknown singer named Luther Vandross. 2 years later, in 1978, he moved to Capitol Records. Reaching for the Sky went gold. The title track became a #6 R&B hit. From there, the albums kept coming. Crosswinds, a collaboration called We're the Best of Friends with Natalie Cole, and Born to Love with Roberta Flack in 1983. A pattern was forming, and it would define the rest of his career. Peabo Bryson was becoming known more than anything as a singer of duets, someone whose voice didn't just perform alongside another voice, but blended with it so completely that audiences couldn't tell where one singer ended and the other began. He had already built an entire career, 20 albums across decades, before most casual listeners had ever heard his name. Then, in the early 1990s, 2 songs would change that, and neither of them at first were even his idea. In 1991, Walt Disney Pictures was finishing a film about a cursed prince and the woman who saw past the curse. They needed a duet for the title track, something that could carry the emotional weight of the entire story in under 3 minutes. Peabo Bryson recorded that duet with Celine Dion. Beauty and the Beast won the Grammy Award for Best Pop Performance by a Duo or Group with Vocal in 1992. A year later, in 1992, Disney needed something similar for a film about a street thief and a princess who escape on a flying carpet. Bryson recorded A Whole New World with Regina Belle. That song won the Academy Award for Best Original Song, a Golden Globe Award, and a second Grammy in 1993, Best Pop Performance by a Duo or Group with Vocal again. 2 songs, 2 films. 2 of the most played pieces of music at weddings, school dances, and bedtime routines for the next 3 decades. And here is the strange part. Bryson became, in the process, the first artist in music history to have separate records top 4 different charts simultaneously. His voice was, by any measurable standard, everywhere. And yet most people who grew up singing along to A Whole New World in the back seat of a car could not have told you his name if you'd asked them directly. He was the voice behind the castle, always present, rarely named. This wasn't new for him, either. Long before Disney, he'd already built a body of solo work that mattered deeply to people who did know his name. Feel the Fire and I'm So Into You in 1978. If Ever You're in My Arms Again in 1984, recorded during his time at Elektra Records, where he was also chosen to sing the theme song for the soap opera One Life to Live in 1985. Later in his career, he toured with the U.S. Revival of The Wiz in 1997 and performed in Porgy and Bess at the Michigan Opera Theater in 1998. In 2015, he recorded Wishes with Kimberly Locke for a Disney charity album supporting the Make-A-Wish Foundation. A quiet, almost poetic full-circle moment, decades after A Whole New World, had made him a household sound, if not always a household name. In 2018, he released what would become his final album, Stand for Love, through Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis's Perspective Records. By then, he had already survived one health crisis that very few people outside his immediate circle fully understood the weight of. And the way he came back from it the first time is part of why almost nobody expected what was coming next. On April 29, 2019, Peabo Bryson suffered a heart attack. He was taken to a hospital in Atlanta. Reports at the time described him as being in stable condition. He made what was described simply as a full recovery. And then he kept going. He went back to touring. He went back to performing the songs that had defined not just his career, but, for millions of people, some of the most emotionally significant moments of their lives. First dances, childhood bedrooms, long car rides. The Golden Touch Tour continued for years afterward. As recently as April 12, 2025, he performed at the Andiamo Celebrity Showroom in Warren, Michigan. Still singing, still touring, still by every visible measure, simply continuing to do what he had done since he was 14 years old. In April 2026, he turned 75. He marked it the way a lot of people mark milestones now, with a carousel of family photos posted to social media. The caption was simple: "This is 75. Thank you for all my well wishes," followed by a heart hands emoji. For a lot of his fans, that post is the last time they saw him, smiling. surrounded by family, celebrating. Within weeks, everything would change. And on May 31st, 2026, a single sentence from CBS News would confirm something that nobody wanted to hear. 3 days after that, his family would have to say something that no family ever wants to say. On May 31st, 2026, CBS News reported that Peabo Bryson had suffered a stroke. A representative for the singer confirmed it to ABC News shortly after. The statement described him plainly, the voice behind the Oscar-winning Disney songs Beauty and the Beast and A Whole New World, and said he was currently receiving medical care. The family asked at that point for privacy as they navigated what they described as a deeply personal moment together. Many fans held on to something specific in that moment. He had done this before. In 2019, his heart had failed and he had come back. He had returned to the stage. He had kept singing. There was real reason, based on his own history, to believe this might go the same way. It didn't. On Tuesday, June 2, 2026, at exactly 5 p.m. Eastern Time in Marietta, Georgia, Peabo Bryson died. The phrase his family chose, and it matters that this was their choice of words, was that he transitioned peacefully and that he was surrounded by the love of his family and those closest to him. The statement, shared through Variety, began with this: with broken hearts and profound sadness, the family of two-time Grammy Award-winning singer, songwriter, and balladeer, Peabo Bryson, announces his passing. It continued by asking, again, for privacy, as they mourn the loss of a beloved husband, father, family member, friend, and artist, whose impact extended far beyond the stage. And then it did something that's worth slowing down on completely. Instead of dwelling on the loss, instead of describing what had happened medically, instead of detailing the stroke or the days in care, or any of the clinical specifics that most public statements about a death include in some form, the family pivoted entirely toward gratitude. We are tremendously moved by the outpouring of love, prayers, and support from fans, friends, and colleagues around the world, they wrote. While our hearts are broken, we find comfort in knowing how deeply Peabo was loved and how many lives were touched by his voice and his generous spirit. His legacy and music will live on for generations to come. No cause of death was released, not in the initial statement and not in the weeks since. The family simply chose not to share it, and as of now, they still haven't. He is survived by his wife, Tanya Boniface Bryson, whom he married in 2010, his children, Robert and Linda, and 3 grandchildren. The reaction beyond his immediate family was immediate and widespread. Atlanta Mayor Andre Dickens released a public statement. Atlanta mourns the loss of one of music's most beloved voices, Peabo Bryson. For decades, Peabo's extraordinary talent, timeless artistry, and unmistakable voice provided the soundtrack to some of life's most cherished moments. Atlanta was proud to call Peabo Bryson one of our own. Regina Bell, his A Whole New World duet partner, the other half of one of the most recognizable vocal performances in Disney history, released her own remembrance of him. What the family chose to say in that statement, and just as importantly, what they chose not to say, tells you something about who Peabo Bryson actually was, separate from the songs entirely. And that brings us to the part of this story that most outlets ran past without slowing down. The cause of death was never released. It likely never will be. On its own, that's not unusual. Many families choose not to share medical details publicly, and there's nothing strange about that choice in isolation. But in this specific case, it's worth thinking about what that choice connects to. Here was a man whose entire public identity was built on being known intimately, through his voice, while remaining, as a person, largely private. Millions of people have cried during A Whole New World at a wedding. Millions of people have felt something specific and personal listening to Beauty and the Beast. His voice has been inside some of the most emotionally significant moments of countless strangers' lives. And yet, almost none of those people could tell you anything about Robert Peabo Bryson, the person. Where he grew up, what his childhood was like, what he actually sounded like when he wasn't singing. Go back to what he said about where his music came from. I was raised by women, my grandmother, until she died, and my mother. My grandmother was a woman who lived and loved with incredible passion. That's not a press-friendly soundbite. That's someone describing the actual emotional architecture underneath everything he ever recorded. A boy on a farm in Mauldin, South Carolina, raised by women who loved without restraint. And a man, decades later, whose family chose to describe his final moments using exactly that language. Not clinical language, not the language of hospitals and diagnoses, the language of love, surrounded by the love of his family and those closest to him. It reads less like a press release and more like the closing of a circle that started on that farm 75 years earlier. There's something else worth noticing. The statement his family released didn't just inform the world that Peabo Bryson had died. It defined, in their own words, on their own terms, what his life and his death meant, before anyone else could define it for them. Before the headlines could reduce him to stroke and 75 and Disney singer, his family got there first, and what they chose to lead with wasn't the medical reality. It was gratitude, it was legacy, it was love. That choice, to answer the world's questions about how he died with an answer about how he was loved instead, may be the most Peabo Bryson thing his family could have done. A man who spent 60 years putting his voice inside other people's most important moments, and whose own family, at the very end, chose to keep the most important moment of all entirely for themselves, and share with the world only the part that mattered, that he was loved and that he is missed, and that the music remains. A boy who didn't fully fit anywhere, not always at school, not always within his own community, found the one place he did fit. At 14 years old, singing backup in a local Greenville band. He spent the next 60 years building a body of work that includes 20 albums, a Grammy for Beauty and the Beast, an Academy Award, and a second Grammy for A Whole New World, and the rare distinction of having topped 4 different charts simultaneously with separate records. And somehow, despite all of that, most people who know every word of those 2 songs by heart have never known his name. That's its own kind of immortality. Beauty and the Beast and A Whole New World will keep playing at weddings, at school dances, in car rides and bedrooms, for generations of people who will never know whose voice they're actually hearing. The songs will outlive the headlines. They'll outlive most of what gets written about him this week. They already have. In a way, they've been outliving the spotlight for over 30 years. He leaves behind a wife, 2 children, 3 grandchildren, and a sound that isn't going anywhere. Which Peabo Bryson song means the most to you? And do you have a memory attached to it? A wedding? A parent? A childhood bedroom? Drop it in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, make sure you check out our video on Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman's Untold story, because that one is about a different kind of love that the world almost missed entirely too. Right here on the Untold story. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a story that deserves to be told.